What's up YouTube? This is Edie here and I'm back again to give you another Future Funk tutorial. Today we're going to do some drum mixing and processing. It's a topic that a lot of new producers struggle with, so hopefully I can provide with some tips and tricks to help you improve with the mixing. Now, before we start on something from scratch, I kind of want to take a little bit of time to analyze the drum mixing in a song. That way we can get a good idea of what we want. In this song, I used a deep kick and I wanted to emphasize on hi-hats and cymbals. I added a subtle snare for the thump, but I wanted the claps to stand out more. Now, let's take a listen without the sample. This is what we want. We want to be able to hear the drums very clearly, and one way we can tell is by isolating the frequencies. That way we can examine what's really going on. Now, in the low ends, from 0 to around 200 hertz, you see that it's just mainly the kick, and as we go higher, you can still hear the kick, but it's just not as prominent, but you can hear the snare and the claps a lot more, along with the hi-hats. The key to drum mixing really is to assign each instrument to its designated space. You'll see that by assigning each instrument to its own space, and by making those instruments stand out in their space, you'll notice that the mix won't sound as jumbled. Drums that are really well mixed together will definitely help when we're mixing the samples too. Here, you can see that the kick and the bass are sharing the space together. However, because there's no other sounds going through, it sounds very clear. Now, if we go to the higher ends, the kick is a lot more subtle, but you can still hear it. In this frequency range, we can hear every other instrument pretty clearly. This helps us as we mix the instruments further to cater toward the sample. Now, let's make a beat from scratch. For this project, I'm going to be using Chicago Street Player as a sample. I'm going to start with making the kick. I'm going to be combining two kicks to make a really full sound. While this kick in particular sounds pretty good, a lot of the times we don't have that luxury. So what we do is we combine them, and what I'm going to do for this one is I'm going to add a high pass filter for the second one. That way the only thing that you'll hear is the higher end of this kick. So once you combine them both together, they won't clash with each other, but they'll combine to make a really nice kick. It's a subtle thing, but sometimes subtle things can make a huge difference in a song. Now, let's do some further mixing in the mixer channel. First things first is that I turn the stereo knob so that the kick is completely mono. Now, it's not entirely necessary to do this, it's more of a preference thing. The first effect was a limiter, and I did a limiter just so I could have the kick at a level that I want it to be. And then afterwards, I used a parametric EQ. And with the parametric EQ, I'm going to lower a bit of the mids. That way I can give it room for the snare and the clap. Afterwards, I put in another limiter just so I could raise it back to the level that I wanted. Because I added an EQ effect, the volume went down, and I want to bring it back to where it was. With the claps, I want to make sure that I can't hear on the lower end, so I'm going to add a high pass filter to make sure that you can only hear it from the mids to the highs. On top of that, I'm going to do a nice little trick that'll make your claps sound really wide. What you do is you get two claps and you get them to hit almost at the same time, but you got to leave a really small delay and of course a little change in pitch. Afterwards, you pan each clap to a different direction, one in the right and the other in the left. That way, when they both play together, it'll give a nice wide sound. You can use the stereo separator in the FX channel to do this sort of effect, but when it comes to percussions and drums, it's a lot more practical to do it this way, at least in my opinion. Next, we work on the hi-hat. Much like the claps, I want to give it a high pass filter. However, I want it to focus more on the high end than the mids. For the snare, I'll wait till it's on the mixer before I make any changes. Now for the clap, there's not much more that I need to do with it. I'm just going to add another filter to make sure it doesn't go below the 200 Hz range. But as you see here, we're already looking pretty good with the clap. I just do a couple of adjustments, but for the most part, we're done with that. Now, for the hi-hat, I do a couple more adjustments. Now, with the EQ, I turn up the high ends and I make sure that the low ends stay pretty standard. I do this just so I can emphasize the high ends even more for the hi-hat. Now, with the snare, I kind of want to put it right in the middle. Because I already have a clap to deal with like the high mids to the high ends, really the snare is just so I could squeeze it right between the kick and the clap. And that way when you hear the entire thing, it'll sound really full, but you won't hear any of the instruments conflicting with each other too much. Okay, so now that we have the drums mixed pretty well, it's time to put them into the song. And first things first, we're going to add the kick and we're going to throw in the sidechain. I used the first limiter on the sample so I could have its peak loudness at the same peak as the kick. And I used the second limiter to do the sidechain effect. At this point, it's a matter of turning on the sidechain and throwing in the kick. Now I'm going to throw in the hi-hats. In this project, I have the hi-hat as loud as the kick, but as you see in my previous project, that wasn't the case. Really, it's just a matter of discretion when you do that. But take a look. Once I put in the filters and I isolate each frequency range, you can tell that it's very clear within those little spaces, and that's because we made it that way. Next we add is the snare. Now, the snare is going to sound really subtle in this track, but that's okay because we want the clap to do most of the work. Now, here's an important detail. Whenever the kick is playing with another instrument at the same time, you'll notice that at that peak, it's a lot louder than the kick itself. This is a bit of a balancing act because you want the kick and the snare to stand out, but you want to maintain a very constant level of loudness. Now, since the snare was pretty quiet to begin with, you won't see much of a problem here. However, once we start putting in the claps, that's when you see a huge change. You can solve it with a limiter or by reducing the volume a little bit, but usually it's better to find the spot where the sounds are conflicting each other and then do the EQing from that point to improve the sound. Now, in this case, I'm just going to turn down the claps a bit. You'll see that even though it's not as loud as it was before, since it's being layered with the snares, it'll still sound pretty good. Just try and reduce it as much as you can without throwing it off the mix. Even if the max volume reduces only by a little bit, I wouldn't sweat it too much, just take it into consideration when you're mixing your track. Once you throw in the sample, of course you would do a little bit more mixing so that it will cater more toward the sample. Because each sample and each style is different, there's not really much I can show you at this point. It's really up to your tastes. But you'll see that when I isolate each individual frequency, that it sounds very clear, and that's because we made it that way. You know, over here you'll see the snare is what's mostly emphasized. Now if I got rid of the snare, you'll definitely notice it being gone. If you look at the high ends, you'll notice that since the hi-hat and the claps are playing at different times, they mix well together. On top of that, their placement in the frequency range are slightly different. Once we play everything together, we can see how clear the mix is. Now, not all songs are the same. Sometimes it'll be a little more complicated for you, depending on what type of style you're going for. Generally speaking, the goal is still the same. If you're having problems with a mix, the best thing you can really do is to isolate the frequencies. That way you can pick out where you might be having a problem. Once you take these things into consideration, it'll definitely improve your mix. I hope you guys enjoyed and learned a couple things in the video. I'll put up the link to the project file in the description below, along with the link to my latest album. If you have any questions or ideas for my next tutorial, definitely leave a comment. Thank you guys so much. Edie out.